Clearly, it's been a big week, and to run through it all, I was joined earlier by Liberal Senator for Victoria, James Paterson, and New South Wales Labor Senator, Jenny McAllister, for our late debate. Jenny McAllister, James Paterson, thanks very much for joining us on Lateline. We'll get to the factional stuff shortly. I want to start, though, with the things that are going to affect our viewers from tomorrow, July the 1st, and there are many of them. This was Bill Shorten's take on it today.
Tomorrow is a dark day for Australia's workforce. Malcolm Turnbull will be giving millionaires a $16,500 pay cut, but he'll be giving 700,000 plus workers a pay cut in their award system on Sunday. It's not good enough.
James Paterson, is tomorrow a dark day for the Australian workforce?
Well, I noticed that Bill Shorten did mention that tomorrow people on the minimum wage are going to get a 3.3% increase. He didn't mention that small businesses up to $25 million in revenue, which includes 3.2 million businesses and 6.5 million workers, are going to get a tax cut down to 27.5%. Tomorrow is going to be a good day because small businesses are going to have more confidence to invest, to hire, and I hope there'll be more hours granted to workers.
Jenny McAllister, is this a win-win? Businesses get more flexibility. The workforce, yes, they get a reduction in penalty rates, but minimum wage, the highest pay rise in 6 years.
I think we need to be very clear that the balance is all wrong when we're trying to undertake both budget repair and stimulate the economy. By cutting wages to some of the economy's lowest paid workers and providing tax cuts to some of the wealthiest, we are further tipping the balance towards the top end of town.
But does that balance out a little bit with that minimum wage increase?
The best case scenario is that the minimum wage increase might compensate for the deduction in pay associated with the penalty rate cuts. And where that leaves workers is in a situation where, yet again, their pay is not really going anywhere. And it's not just bad for those individual workers and individual families, but we're hearing from the Treasury Secretary, we're hearing from the Reserve Bank that this is a drag on growth. And if we want a strong, growing economy, if we want jobs and growth, as was promised, we should be looking at spreading some of the benefits down to the bottom of the economy.
James Paterson, a few other changes happening tomorrow as well. The bulk billing freeze is being lifted, a lot of changes to superannuation, one of them meaning that you can put over and above your super contributions in to help you for a housing deposit. All of that impacts on the budget, and we've got debt at over $500 billion at the moment. Are you comfortable with all of those matters?
Well, I would have liked to have been made more progress on budget repair. There's no question that me and all my colleagues are frustrated that we've had more difficulty than we should have had in trying to get the budget back to balance. Unfortunately, many of the savings measures that we've proposed in recent years have not passed the Senate. Even ones that we took to the last election have been rejected by the Senate and for which we earned a mandate. So we're doing the best we can in the circumstances we have. And I think actually we've made some good progress, but there's no question there's more to be done.
Well, Tony Abbott put up an interesting solution again this week for getting things through a difficult Senate. This is what he had to say. He called it the mother of all reforms.
An amendment to section 57 of the Constitution so that legislation rejected twice in the Senate, 3 months apart, could be put to a joint sitting of both houses of Parliament without the need for a double dissolution election first.
Jenny McAllister, it's meant to be a house of review, but often we see it as a house of horse trading. It's the deals that are made with the crossbenchers that get things through the Senate. Is that really the best way for this to operate, or is there some truth in what Tony Abbott is saying there?
Look, I think that it's hard not to see Mr Abbott's contribution as part of a months-long campaign of destabilisation.
And we'll get to that, but just on
and it's really not the Senate's fault that the government keeps serving up unpalatable propositions. And I go back to my earlier comments. There is a way to stimulate growth in the economy, repair the budget that is fair, that spreads the burden fairly across the Australian population. But the government persists in throwing up measures which really do benefit wealthy people at the expense of middle and low income people. And I think it's unsurprising that the Senate's really not willing to engage on that basis.
James Paterson, you take quite an interest in matters of constitutional affairs. What do you think of that proposal from Tony Abbott? Does it have any merit?
Well, like Tony, I share his frustration that many of the measures of both his previous government and the current government haven't succeeded in getting through the Senate. But that's not really the Senate's fault. That's the fault of the parties that make up the Senate, including the crossbench and the Labor Party and the Greens. But having said that, in recent times, we've had more success in getting bills through. I'll highlight particularly in the industrial relations space, some real success in restoring the Australian Building and Construction Commission or the Registered Organisations Commission. So I don't think it's too dire yet that we need such a radical reform. And I don't want to sound like a self-interested senator protecting my own patch, but as someone who believes in our constitutional framework, taking away a very important check and balance in the system, effectively what Tony's proposing would mean the Senate could only delay legislation put up by a government. It could never stop it. I think that's a very dangerous path to go down.
So, James Paterson, tell me straight, more broadly, is Tony Abbott helping?
Well, this week hasn't helped, to be completely candid with you, David. You can't spin the unspinnable. It's been a very inelegant week on behalf of the government, and I think all my colleagues
And is Tony
feel
Abbott
that
to
way.
blame for that?
Look, he's not solely to blame. Look, I'm a backbencher who has, from time to time, utilised the freedom of the backbench to speak out on ideas. So I'm never going to suggest that any other backbench colleague shouldn't be allowed to do that. But when I choose to speak out on issues that are important to me and close to my heart, I do so judiciously. I don't do it every week. I don't do it on every issue. And if I did, and if all my other colleagues did, a functioning government would cease to exist. So we have to be very measured and careful about how we choose to speak out if we're going to choose to.
Because it seems to me that your party, or at least enough members in your party, have decided that ideology is more important than winning elections.
Oh, I don't think that's a fair characterisation. I mean, the Liberal Party exists to win government so we can implement our philosophy, and they are two sides to the same coin. There's no point winning government if you're not using it to implement your philosophy, and there's no point having a great philosophy if you're not in government to deliver it. So they go hand in hand. The idea that one comes at the expense of the other, I think, is wrong. It is a balance that we have to find, and that's a constant
But is it out of balance now? I mean, it seems to be. This just seems to be one side fighting with the other, rather than aiming for the middle where the voters are.
I'm a newer Member of Parliament. I came in after the leadership change, and one of the observations I've made is that healthy internal philosophical debates can happen, but they have to happen in an environment of goodwill, and it's much harder if people see differences of opinion through a prism of leadership. So I think the sooner as a party we get beyond those questions, beyond those issues, I think the better off we'll be.
But just briefly, you'd think it might be worth a few members of your party piping up for a while?
Well, I mean, I think internal debate is a perfectly fine thing to have. We shouldn't ever pretend as a political party.
But this isn't internal. This is full frontal, out there, alternate manifesto to government policy.
Well, even public debate, I think, is tolerable within limits, and that's why I said I choose when I speak out on issues as judiciously as I can and in as a measured way as possible.
Jenny McAllister, you were National President of Labor. Well, I think it was from 2011, right in the middle of all of its woes. What did Labor do to get in the position that you're at, that you're currently the only major party that's not tearing itself apart?
I will answer that, but I will just observe that one of the big differences between our troubles and the troubles as I perceive them in the coalition party room is that I see the coalition at the moment as being deeply and fundamentally divided on big questions of direction for the Australian economy and the Australian society more generally. And whether that's energy or defence policy or immigration, there seems to be no middle ground. And that wasn't present for Labor in our difficult period. I think our people, and like James, I wasn't there at the time, but I think our people recognise that was a disappointing period for us. We failed to deliver.
So what was different? Yours was about personalities.
It often was, that's right. And I think what we have resolved as a group is that we want to deliver on the things we believe in, and we are determined to work together collectively to deliver that. It produces dialogue internally that's respectful, that's consultative, and that is where we find ourselves now.
Did you need the massive loss in 2013 to clear out some of those personalities so that you could move forward as a party, a united party?
I think the loss galvanised people and motivated people to change their behaviour.
Well, it's been a pretty difficult week this week as well for the Catholic Church. Aside from the obvious, the census showed that it's no longer the most popular religion. It's been overtaken by a response of no religion, which is at 30% compared to 22% now for the Catholic Church. And yet this is how we start every parliamentary sitting day. Have a look.
Almighty God, we humbly beseech thee to vouchsafe thy blessing upon this Parliament. Direct and prosper our deliberations to the advancement of thy glory and the true welfare of the people of Australia.
Now, of course, you don't have to change long-held traditions in an institution just after one poll, albeit a big one, the census. But for a secular democracy, James Paterson, and an institution that is meant to be removed from the church, a multi-faith community, is it time to rethink the way that we start every day in Parliament?
I don't think so. I think the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of Parliament is a nice nod to tradition and history and to the Judeo-Christian influence on our system of government. I'm personally agnostic. I'm not a religious person, but it doesn't cost me or harm me in any way that we begin the day with that prayer. We also do a welcome to country, acknowledgement of traditional owners. Now, Indigenous Australians are nowhere near a majority of Australians, and no one would suggest that if there were fewer Indigenous Australians, we should drop that. It's also a nod to our culture and our history and our origins, and I think they're equally appropriate, and I support them staying in place.
What do you think, Jenny McAllister?
Well, like James, I'm not a believer, so I use that moment of the day for a little bit of quiet reflection. I do think I would be interested to know what people would say if you asked them about this question, because I think the fact that individuals responding to the census say that they themselves aren't believers would necessarily translate into opposition to prayer at public gatherings. I think perhaps a little, as James states, people might accept that as being part of the tradition. It doesn't cost me to participate in that.
It's a very Catholic prayer. Would we be better off with a more general prayer because, you know, we now have Muslim members of Parliament and other religions. Would there be a prayer that would be perhaps more multi-faith, James?
Well, I don't think it's a Catholic prayer. It's a Christian prayer, and that's in recognition that our religious heritage is largely Christian, and still, even in this census, a majority of Australians are Christians. I think a little bit over 50%. The next most populous religion, I think, is Islam, and it's at 2%. So it's a long way to go before any other religion replaces Christianity as the dominant system of faith in Australia. So no, I think it's an appropriate nod to history, and we do it in other contexts and at other times we do appropriate acknowledgements of other faiths, and I think that's healthy.
You agree with that?
Yes, and I would observe actually that whilst it's not something that I participate in, it is something that many of my colleagues do and I think take quite seriously, and I'd have regard to that in considering the question as well.
All right, well, some consensus to finish off our discussion, and a very non-consensual consensus week, if you like. James Paterson, Jenny McAllister, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, David.